Adnan, as a contributing editor for Maclean's magazine, you've recently covered or did I guess, an opinion piece about the mass graves in Canada. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The purpose of it for me was to really put this into context for Canada. I think that, this kind of thing happens around the world, largely in war zones and mostly in the war zones that I've worked in. And often the purpose behind it, from my experiences with mass graves and with unmarked graves in places like Iraq or in Afghanistan, is, I mean, it's like I said in that piece, it's about a mass erasure, really. I mean, it's about a period of history that those in power don't want to be remembered, right? And I think that we're constantly in a struggle to tell the story of our past and tell our history. And that story changes depending on who's telling the story, right? And I think that it's important to really look at our history honestly. And I think, this is something that I've learned over the years covering these war zones is, places like Iraq, Afghanistan, especially a country like Pakistan, for instance, which I've covered quite a bit, and I'm originally from there. One of the reasons it hasn't been able to really get its get itself on a positive path is because it doesn't have an honest accounting of its own history, right? I mean,
So,
it
do you think
doesn't.
our indigenous mass graves is uh, is kind of like the American slavery period?
I think
That
there's a
the
certain. I
original
think there's a
sin that
certain.
they can't get past in order to get on the right track, they have to confront it and they cannot deny it?
Sure, I think it's the same species of issues, right? I mean, we're talking about here. I mean, I think, and in fact, I think, there's even a connection, a direct connection with this, accounting that Canada is dealing with now, and the accounting that the U.S. is sort of facing in terms of owning up to and facing its history of slavery
So
and how much.
how does a society decide whether they're going to do remembrance or erasure?
I think you and I, being of the same kind of generation, we can remember what we were taught in elementary school about the colonial past in Canada. I mean, it was a very whitewashed history that we learned, and I think that was the product of um, political decisions, but also I think who writes these books, history books. Um, whose accounting do we have of history? I mean, largely our history in a country like Canada, when it comes to our colonial history, I mean, it's based on colonial writers who were writing from a specific perspective, right? So I think listening to the perspective of the other side, so to speak, or listening to
But
multiple perspectives is important, right?
if you cannot zero in on specific people who made specific decisions, the kind of subject or oppressed information for all the rest, then can you hold anyone accountable for these things that happen? Can we even point our finger at the government for the stuff that happened on those reserve schools?
I don't know. I don't know if accountability is maybe the right way of putting it. I don't know. I wouldn't want to point the finger and to blame, or especially. I mean, I think today it's there's nobody left to really directly blame. I mean, the people that committed these atrocities, or even with the residential schools, they're mostly not around these days anymore. Although there is some. Actually, with the residential schools, there may be, because these things were running until the 1990s, right? So I think that there is some direct accounting to be had for that. But I think it's more important to change our history, and our understanding and the stories that we tell about to ourselves about our past, right? Like those stories we're now starting to realize were largely fictions, and so I think, we're starting to grapple with those fictions collapsing around us, not just here in Canada, but in the US as well. So, and I think that some people that have benefited from those fictions are going to resist that. I think we need to keep pushing
So,
through.
what's the danger of perpetuating the fiction, and who's to benefit for perpetuating a fiction like this?
Well, it's always, I mean, history is always about power. I mean, history, I think we have to understand history not as a science, and I don't want to use the cliche of it being an art either, but histories are stories, and storytelling is about power, because the storyteller who tells the story is telling the story in a way that is advantageous to them, right? So I think it's a question of who is given a voice to tell the story and who's privileged to have the voice to tell the story.
That create kind of a confusion or misinformation or people not understanding which source they can trust?
Well, also it's a question of what we think of as truth and fiction, and what do we think of as knowledge and not knowledge. I'll give you a good example. Today, I was just reading a really interesting article. I think it was from 2016 in the Atlantic, about the earth, about the next big earthquake that's predicted to hit the west coast of Canada in the U.S. Right. And it was only recently, like in the last 20 years, really, when the seismologists and geographers really discovered this fault and realized that there could be a gigantic earthquake that could hit this part of the continent, right? And how they discovered this was through some research that was done in Japan, but then they cross-referenced that research with stories that indigenous West people in Western Canada had been telling for generations about a massive earthquake that had hit, massive floods that had hit in around the 17th century, early 18th, I think late 17th century, the last time there was a big earthquake in this area. And people start to realize that we discounted these stories because there were oral stories of the indigenous populations here. So that's not knowledge, right? So I think that's a really good example of how we decide what is knowledge and what isn't knowledge, and what we privilege as knowledge and what we discount as knowledge, right?
Well, a lot of our reality, our shared objective reality, is based on us agreeing on something. It's like money, right? We all agree that the red one is worth 50 and the green one is worth 20. And even though it's the same piece of paper, we have to agree that this one is worth more. And that's what makes it more valuable, is our collective consensus.
Yeah, but I think that's the difference being with history, is that you're not talking about a tangible object or an objective sort of. History is an experience. It's not to sort of kid ourselves into thinking that that there's an absolute objectivity in history. We've even learned in our sort of era of documentation, where everything is documented on video or on photo. Everybody has a camera. That in fact, counterintuitively, maybe you would think that you'd have a more objective reality because of that, because everything is being documented. But the reality is that we have less of an objective reality because we're getting all of these confused perspectives then out of context, and it's actually causing.
This is what I mean. So you're saying the answer is to let everybody share their perspective of history. Aren't you describing exactly what the consequence?
That's another discussion. That's another debate.